Hello and welcome to PolitFlix episode 15. Now, the theme of today's is Robin Hood on film. The reason it's taken quite a long time to get back to it is because initially it was going to be a much more ambitious thing. I was going to try and tackle King Arthur and Robin Hood. And I think it was Dave, I'm going to introduce in a second to you. Oh, sod it. Dave, you're here, aren't you?
Yeah,
I think it was Dave who sort of said, look, James, trying to do both in one session would be crazy. Let's take a little bit more time and watch a wider variety of films, and let's do two separate podcasts, but still look at the overlap. So the usual formula is there. We will look at some current film news. We will look at, I suppose, the slightly political slant of each of the Robin Hood versions that we've chosen, whilst realising that it is kind of an overview, and we can't obviously do the entire canon of Robin Hood on film because that would just be stupid, let alone...
over 100 versions.
There were over 100 versions, let alone trying to cross it over with King Arthur, which would just be, podcast suicide. But we are here. We're very happy to be here, at least. I'm very happy to be here. Dave, how are things? You okay?
Yeah, good. I have watched the King Arthur films we were going to watch as well, but I think actually with the King Arthur films, we can throw in Excalibur and a few other things and a few, sort of against the round table type films and maybe bulk that one out. As it is, we've watched, is it 3 or 4 Robin Hood films? Well, 4 actually, because I watched the Disney one as well. But, I think actually it isn't the most obvious, but when you start to think about Robin Hood, there's a political slant to every single take of it, and I could almost postulate that there almost isn't a director out there who couldn't have a take on Robin Hood.
Well, since that segs very nicely into what you're doing at the moment, Quentin Tarantino, what's his Robin Hood like, other than very sweary?
Well, I mean, his Robin Hood would be absolutely an anti-hero. There's no doubt about that. But yeah, Tarantino, we took a bit of a break. We're through the first 3, and then we took a month off.
This is your other podcast. Do you expect us to talk?
Yeah, we came back, did a charity podcast, A Native Mind. We did a commentary on Coming to America, and tonight we return to Tarantino, but we ease in with the first commentary we've done, if I think about it, where we haven't covered the film in the series as well.
Yeah.
So normally we'll cover The Spy Who Loved Me, and a few episodes later we'll get to commentaries and we'll say, let's do a commentary on that film. He didn't direct From Dusk Till Dawn, so it's not in the main review section. But but it got floated as an idea. There was a lot of positivity from people out there about us possibly doing a commentary on it. So we're going to cover that tonight.
Yeah, and it's Robert Rodriguez when he was very hot property in Hollywood.
It would have been within a year of Desperado.
And when he was being actively, I think, courted to direct a Zorro, which he didn't do, although some of his ideas, certainly in terms of things like casting Antonio in the lead, spilled over into, I think it was budgetary, the reason they didn't do that. I mean, the other thing I remember about From Dusk Till Dawn, other than not seeing the pictures because I was not 18 at the time, was when Clooney was announced. It was announced as he was being announced as Batman. I was quite shocked that Val Kilmer had suddenly stood down. But when I saw Clooney, and I hadn't actually seen ER at that point, I obviously, as a Batman fan, rushed to kind of get some ER episodes. But I can see that you mentioned that it's a still shot from Dusk Till Dawn that sold Warner's on the idea that he's Batman.
Yeah, I don't actually know which shot. I don't know if it was a poster or whatever, but I do believe. I don't think it's a Bruckheimer production, those Batman films. Whoever it was on the production team, and it is a name, and I forget who it was.
Right. Is it Joel? Is it Joel Schumacher?
I suppose it could have been. But
Yeah.
I mean, I don't recall, but somebody took a still of him from those films and kind of drew a cowl on it and said that would work. He's got the right jaw, he's got the right sort of height, and everything else. And when he was announced, and I started thinking about it through the prism of like Keaton and so on, I could really see it, but obviously we didn't get what we thought we were going to get. As much as we might want to sort of blame Joel Schumacher for that, and as the director, he has to take the lion's share of the blame. I do remember interviews from the time with Clooney, the junkets for Batman and Robin. And he said that first cuts of the script, he said, they were asking about where Bruce Wayne and Batman is in this film. And he said, well, his parents, he's past all that now. And he said, he said in other interviews, which misses the point. I know you're giggling because you're missing the point of Batman entirely. Because he said that when he saw first cuts of the script, and we're now in the 4th film, he said, there's still stuff about him, feeling guilty about his parents, and he was like, for goodness sake. And I think fundamentally that says that Clooney, left to his own devices, doesn't get the character enough to play it.
Yeah.
With the right director explaining to him, I mean, had a Nolan come along earlier and cast him, and maybe talk to him more about the character, then maybe the penny would have dropped. But the George Clooney that turned up on set to play Batman fundamentally thought that a middle-aged man who was extremely rich should be past the death of his parents by now. Well, the whole point of Batman is it never ends.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's only one. There's like one scene in Batman Robin where, well, there are two scenes where you just get this glimpse that yes, you could really have done this properly. There's one where he's having a sort of a fight on the stairs with an over-earnest Chris O'Donnell on the stairs, and he says, "Don't push me right now," and he just gives a look, and you just think yes. And the tender stuff he does with the dying Alfred.
The tender stuff he does with the Alfred, because George Clooney, I mean, he used to get noted for obvious things. One, his looks, he's a good-looking man. But there always used to be a thing, particularly in this era, about what sort of great movie hair he had. How he had, like, really great hair.
Yeah.
Actually, what he actually has is a very, very tender voice.
Hmm.
And he was very good in the Alfred stuff. It wasn't without merit, but he fundamentally didn't get the character.
Yeah, his voice. He's an excellent voice user. Actually, I'm glad you noticed that. And as I say, as Ross particularly in ER, that was the thing that I noticed. And the other thing about him.
Well, he was a paediatrician as well, so in ER, so he was standing up for the most vulnerable.
That's right. Very Batman. Ironically enough, he was more Batman as Doctor. It's like we were saying about Pierce, about dear old Pierce. Pierce is more Bond in his non-Bond role.
He's more Bond as Thomas Crown or Andrew, whatever he's called in the Tailor of Panama, than he was in Bond. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could see on the strength of From Dusk Till Dawn why you would cast him as Batman. Totally.
Yes. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope it'll be a fun listen. And then you're on to Kill Bill, of course.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to getting back to that, actually. I mean, I prepped it a month ago. I mean, I won't go into the circumstances, but our hiatus came all of a sudden. So I was all prepped for Kill Bill. So in some respects, I've got to crank. One of the reasons I think we're going ahead with sort of warm-up commentaries is almost to get the machinery cranked up again.
Yeah.
Because I was living Tarantino more than I've lived any series since Bond. I was driving to work. I mean, I've moved house now, but I was living half an hour from home, from work rather. And I was playing the soundtracks all the way there. I was playing them at work. I was reading things. I was watching the films. And, of course, all that machinery is ground to a halt now. And I had Kill Bill prepped. So, obviously, I need to prep that again. But we'll take up with that at the weekend and then plough on through all the way to Marvel.
You mentioned Bond and Tarantino sort of back to back. It's one of those myths I'd really love to shoot down about the idea that there was a Tarantino Casino Royale ready to go. In the same way as I think ultimately the Star Trek thing may turn out to be a bit of just something that gets discussed but doesn't necessarily get past the development phase.
Yeah, I mean, the Quentin Tarantino with the obvious disclaimer is we weren't there. So, excuse me. What I'm saying is the best of my understanding. Okay, so any of this could be wrong. If Quentin Tarantino, God bless him, ever heard this, he would go, "That's not what happened at all." But he talked a lot about how he wanted to adapt Casino Royale as a period piece in the 50s.
Yes.
With Pierce Brosnan shot black and white with Uma Thurman as Vesper, and it was going to be set after the death of Tracy, which actually, if you read Casino Royale, is entirely possible. That could be at any point in his career, although it does suit a very green new agent. Well, not a new agent, but a new 00.
Yeah.
But anyway, he because also when you think about it, as books go as well, if you ramp up stakes over time, Casino Royale represents a decent base because it's a book. It's a book about a card game. But I know, and Pierce Brosnan has backed this up, that he did meet with Pierce Brosnan. Pierce Brosnan was still the Bond of record, but they hadn't decided what they were going to do post Die Another Day. Don't know if Die Another Day was out yet. Suspect it was. So my best guess is this is around early 2003. They met in some bar in a hotel, got extremely drunk, ended up sort of helping each other out the bar. They were so hammered, and they talked about this idea. Pierce Brosnan was very keen. Now, the two or three things are worth noting here. firstly, Tarantino did not ingratiate himself very well with the producers because he talked about how they'd said Casino Royale was unfilmable, and it's only when he talked about it and all the rest of it. I doubt. I mean, if someone can point me to the clip or the article, then I'll happily be proved wrong. But I don't think the Bond producers have ever considered Casino Royale unfilmable.
No.
I think it's not unfilmable, it's just not a film. I said this on my review of Casino Royale, you need to bookend it a little bit, that's all. Which the film does quite effectively. There's nothing in it that's inherently unfilmable. The second thing, of course, is getting Pierce Brosnan keen and on board is not the same as getting the gig. And I think, finally, it's the reverse of Steven Spielberg with Return of the Jedi. Return of the Jedi was a non-union film because it was made independently by Lucasfilm, and he'd been fined, or rather Irving Kershner had been fined, but George Lucas paid it after The Empire Strikes Back, because Directors Guild rules at that time said that in the opening of the film, or the opening credits or whatever, you needed the directed by credit. Now, the Star Wars format doesn't fit that. You get Lucasfilm, back in the day it was Fox, and then you get the Star Wars and then the Crawl. So it was a non-union film. So when they talk about Steven Spielberg having done that film, my understanding, and it may be wrong, is that he couldn't, because he is a DGA director and they will not let you do non-union films. Tarantino is the opposite. Tarantino is not a member of the Directors Guild, nor is Robert Rodriguez, for that matter. The Bond series hires directors that are DGA affiliated. So my feeling is Tarantino wanted to do it. Pierce Brosnan was fascinated at the idea, particularly after something like Die Another Day, but it would have had to have been a Kevin McClory type production. Kevin McClory being the man who always tried to set up a rival series and did Never Say Never Again, for it ever to happen. Now, Quentin Tarantino, where he here might say to us, no, that's not what happened. I did meet with Eon. Those Directors Guild rules wouldn't have applied because of X, Y, and Z. They did actually say this. I may be wrong, but that's my understanding. Quentin Tarantino would never have done Casino Royale.
Yeah. I mean, there is a certain injustice in so far as, I mean, there must be moments where Pierce, although he's generally been pretty diplomatic about the whole thing, including, appearing on the retrospective documentary and all that. But occasionally, because I remember reading a piece with him when he was still Bond. I think just once again, Between the World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day, and he was saying, "Yeah, there are some things I'd like to do with Bond. I'd like to bring back Trace. I'd like to bring back Blofeld. I'd love to have an adventure where he just gives up on the killing, just gets into his car and drives off." And I was thinking, they did actually do that with a little film called Spectre. I'm not saying they nicked Pierce's idea, but... And the other thing is, Daniel got Sam Mendes on the basis of a conversation that is exactly like the one that Pierce had with Tarantino.
Yes, but there's a difference. I mean, yes, they did scour the world for Daniel Craig, but Daniel Craig was the first words off Barbara Broccoli's tongue when they were talking about replacing Pierce Brosnan. He was the first choice. They did their due diligence on it, but he was the first choice. And they are in love with this man, hence the rush of getting Spectre back in, crowbarred back in when perhaps it should have been unfolded with the next Bond.
Yeah.
Pierce Brosnan never had that. You have to remember, Pierce Brosnan was about the last thing Cubby Broccoli ever did. So he wasn't, I'm sure they got on very well, but you had a younger producer there than she is now, a much greener producer than she is now, desperate not to fuck it up, taking over from one of the legendary producers of all time, and the James Bond of record at the time wasn't her pick.
Yeah. I mean, you say that they got on well. I mean, the fact of the matter is, as I say, I'm sympathetic to Pierce, and, it's all water under the bridge now, it's 15 years ago or whatever, but the fact of the matter is, for a guy who'd been so diplomatic, who'd been so good at giving the right answers all the time and playing things so smoothly, I think there was a period, rightly or wrongly, between Die Another Day and Casino Royale where he was mouthing off a bit and he wasn't being as diplomatic, particularly about the Broccoli's. He was using words like creative paralysis and so on, and I just thought,
I couldn't remember the exact words.
Yeah.
I was about to sort of talk around that quote.
Yeah.
Because I remember that interview. They're struck by creative paralysis. They don't know how to move forward.
Yeah, and I don't think he necessarily meant that in a bad way. And people say things that maybe they don't realise the impact of.
Early on, when Craig took the role, and the first time he got injured on set,
Yeah.
someone caught like Brosnan at a premiere or a junket or something and said, "Did you hear this happened?" And he just laughed his ass off. Now I don't imagine. I mean, Pierce Brosnan, from everything we know about the man, is an all-round good guy.
Yeah.
But I think it took a while for the bitterness to fade, and he didn't watch a Bond film again, or one from his successor anyway, until Skyfall, when he watched it on a plane and was like, "Wow, this is really good."
Yeah. Yeah, I think he saw Skyfall a couple of times, and he was then able to give an honest opinion on Spectre, which was, I liked bits of it, but I thought maybe the plot could have been tightened. Amen, Pierce. But yeah, it's funny because the story he tells about Casino Royale is almost identical to the one he tells about The Living Daylights, which is that for The Living Daylights, when Tim had got the part and he was on the plane and he says he was watching it with his son, and his son said, "Where's Daddy?" And it was very touching. And then he says there was a similar occasion in Casino Royale. He tried to watch it on the plane and it kept packing up, and he just thought it was fate.
He wanted it all his life. You
Yeah.
know, he gets it. There was a bit of history there because Cubby always wanted him. His wife had been in a Bond film. He'd been hanging around the set and everything else as a very young man. He was anointed as a future Bond by the powers that be within Eon. He gets the role. He's forced to drop out of the role. When he finally takes it on, he gets a director he adored working with in Martin Campbell, produces a film that, although I think is not maybe as good as its general reputation, is very liked in GoldenEye. And then thereafter, you've got 5 or 6 years of really diminishing returns, and it would not be hard to think he must be disappointed when he now looks at like a Casino Royale or a Skyfall and sees heavyweight themes and real scenes to get your teeth into. His Bond era is extremely lightweight.
Yeah, but he was still James Bond. I'm not going to lose any sleep over it.
He was still James Bond, and he's one of the 6, and he's got, I always say this about Craig when they're talking about tiredness and 3 or 4 year gaps. Suck it up. It's 10 years then immortality, and Brosnan is proof of that. He had 7 years from his first film to his last film, 10 years from sort of casting to firing, if you like. And whatever you think of the relative films, his name is now there in history. And any box set that comes out, there's 6 of them stood there, and he's one of them.
That's right. That's right. I mean, they're remarkably indulgent with the Craig era, giving him that. Bearing in mind that it's yet another year, as you've pointed out, it's a long wait, and Daniel will be 51 doing it. Yeah.
Which I think is just about okay. Broadly speaking, I mean, it depends on the actor.
Yeah.
But if you said to me, as a general rule, where do you draw the line? It's early 50s, because when you go back to the books, they're active as 00s between, I think, 35 and 45. 45 is the mandatory retirement age, but that's 45 in the 50s.
Yeah.
So I think now that could well...
you can take it to 50.
I think you can stretch that another 7 or 8 years. If you said to me now, he will do another one in 2021, which he won't, but let's say he does, it'll be 53. I just clench my jaw very slightly, like, not so sure about that. But 51, 52, yeah, okay.
Which leads us into the kind of news, for want of a better term. See, Lewis Gilbert, is it they just announced the death?
We are recording on the day that, certainly, I haven't read the articles because, frankly, there's nothing to read. I know what Lewis Gilbert made, and they are... I don't need to read the article, but that does mean I don't know if he died today or whether it's just been reported today.
I assumed he died ages ago. I mean, I didn't. I mean, of course, 97 is a good innings.
Still alive. I knew he was still alive and in his 90s. I couldn't remember his year of birth. I knew it was in the 1920s, and I knew it was the early 20s. But I think he was. I thought he was like Stan Lee, 1922, and he actually turns out to be 1920. I knew he was still alive. Lewis Gilbert, for those of you listening, directed 3 Bond films. He directed The Fifth Entry, which was You Only Live Twice with Sean Connery, and then he directed The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker back-to-back with Roger Moore's 3rd and 4th entries. Of all of those, they're all very well-known Bond films. I mean, all Bond films are very well-known, but unlike a For Your Eyes Only, they all stand out in the series. And The Spy Who Loved Me is sort of the definitive Roger Moore film. It's not my favourite of his, but it is to Roger Moore what GoldenEye is to Pierce, or Goldfinger is to Sean, or Casino. You know what I mean? It's his Bond film, and it's one of the greats. And of course, much like Skyfall, it came out in a Jubilee year. So it really did catapult the series on when the previous film, The Man with the Golden Gun, hadn't been that popular. But outside of that, he also did, I think he did Alfie. He also did Shirley Valentine, and he did Educating Rita, which is a really good, fun
It's a
sort
lovely
of
film. Lovely,
Michael
lovely
Caine
film.
film.
Yeah.
It's Michael Caine and Julie Walters. Julie Walters goes back to sort of college as a mature student, and she's taught by Michael Caine, who's a bit of a drunk. It's good fun.
Yeah. I mean, I remember the bit, what is it? The difference between tragic and tragedy. No, there's some story about the guy gets run over. People say that's a tragedy. It might be tragic. It is not a tragedy. And Julie Walters goes, it is for the bloomin' guy who got run over. Whatever it is.
Oh yeah, I mean that role, that line alone. If you've ever seen Julie Walters in a film, you can hear her say that. That line could have been written for her. In fact, it probably was. But yeah, Lewis Gilbert had a very distinguished career. None of his Bond films are amongst my favourites, but they are all amongst sort of the better known Bond films, and certainly in one case, because he effectively remade the film 3 times, but The Spy Who Loved Me, I would suggest if you aggregated Bond fans' rankings, you know, you took 100 Bond films and just 100 Bond fans and aggregated their rankings, The Spy Who Loved Me would appear in the top 10.
Yeah. No, it's what it represents as much as anything else. And
because it was Jubilee year, and it was a series that had struggled.
Yeah, it's that Union Jack thing, isn't it? It's the Union Jack imagery.
Which makes no sense, but yeah. And it does still have possibly the best pre-title sequence in the whole series, and I would argue Carly Simon's song is the best of the series title songs.
Alan Partridge agrees with you, so he's coming back, I see, to the BBC, which is great news.
Alan Partridge, yeah, he's back in sort of a magazine format style show, so we'll see what that's like. It won't be there out till the autumn, but they are filming.
Actually, we've been talking to Sally Phillips's people about maybe getting an interview or getting her on the podcast. It's going to be tricky, but it's not beyond the bounds of possibility.
Cool, worth a try.
Yeah, I always thought she was hilarious in there.
I know Lynn is going to be, the character of Lynn is going to be in the show.
Yes.
So when I read about it, because I thought it was going to be like a one style kind of show, the one show. But Lynn is going to be sort of offset doing things, and I'm thinking that sounds very Larry Sanders.
It does, doesn't it? And interesting enough, I think that was the very format that they toyed with because if you look at the first series of I'm Alan Partridge, it finishes with him getting a second series. With he's had to forge the contract because the guy's just died. Spoiler.
Well, they could have decided to do another series 2 years later where he did do that. Series.
Yeah, and I think they began experimenting, and I think in the end they just said no because the sitcom format for him is about him not having
to lose.
Yeah, being in that kind of stasis. I think they regret not putting him in the hotel for another year because they felt that alone. And I agree with that because I think Sally Phillips is hilarious, but they had an equally funny setup in the kitchenette with Sonia, the girlfriend, and managing to have Michael in it again. Hey, Mr. Partridge, absolutely. So I'm looking forward to that. Should be terrific. Did you see the Super Bowl trailers?
Yeah, I think I've seen them all. I mean, the only one I'm not sure I've seen is I don't think I saw the skyscraper one. I don't think I saw.
You have to. You must, because it's hilarious. And it's brilliant.
James, remind me. I tell you what. Let's just do it as a bit of a sort of pop answer thing. Name them because I can't remember. What have we seen?
Mission Impossible, Sky Fallout, or Fallout, whatever it's called.
It's called Fallout. Yeah. Mission Impossible. I think we're just going to get more of what we've had in the last 2 or 3, and that's absolutely fine by me.
Yes.
I think that series. What it doesn't have is the weight of history and some of the tropes the Bond series has. There is a class about Bond, the gun barrel at the start of the film, and the very recognisable musical style of the film, and so on. Mission Impossible doesn't quite have that. But I have to say, watching Ghost Protocol and Rogue Nation, the way they sort of fire up the theme at the start of the film, particularly Ghost Protocol, this series could run forever. And as much as people might think it's a sort of Tom Cruise show, yes, it is. But there is a format that can live beyond that, provided we still commit to doing the stunts.
Well, that was the idea with Jeremy Renner initially. I mean, we offer thoughts and prayers for Jeremy Renner because he keeps getting cast in franchises as the guy that you're passing the baton to. And poor old Jeremy always gets a bad deal in the sense that he accepts the franchise baton and then he's cast in something else, which means he can't then commit to taking... he's a victim of his own success.
I actually felt sorry for him when I went to see Rogue Nation, because Ghost Protocol was a two-hander. You could see that was that was Cruise was on the wane and he was heading towards 50,
Yeah.
and you could see they were trying to replace him with someone a bit alike. Now, I don't think they're very similar screen presences, but what they haven't done, a bit like Bond, they don't go and cast someone of 22. They cast someone in Jeremy Renner who was well into his 30s at that point. Very physical, very good at the physical stuff, and maybe you can sort of transition the... Because it won't be like Bond. I don't think they'll recast Ethan Hunt. I think if they carry on without Cruise at any point...
He can play the Peter Graves part.
He totally could.
Yeah.
But yeah, a Fallout, I mean, I can't remember much about it now, but...
Well, Henry Cavill's in it, and he stands out, because I have a theory he's the baddie, or at least I hope he is, because I think it'd be interesting.
What, like a turncoat?
Something like that, I hope so. Unless they really are having him as the...
I didn't love The Man from U.N.C.L.E., but Henry Cavill is often portrayed, partly because of Superman. I mean, you go on Bond sites, and there's reference to Henry Cavill, and they go, oh no, he can't act, he's so wooden. Henry Cavill is as charming as they fucking come. All you need to be sure of, which they didn't do in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., is he has to lose some of the bulk.
He looked too big.
Because they put him in a suit in The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and it was like he was straining to stay in it. Although he was shooting around, the Superman reshoots, hence the whole moustache thing, he actually looks a bit more proportionate in the Mission Impossible film. I think a bit like Brosnan, he'll actually play better as an anti-hero than he will as a straight out,
Yeah,
hero.
and exactly like Brosnan as well. He's just a very, very nice guy from the looks of things. He's just he conducts himself very well.
If Henry Cavill ends up as Bond, I'm quite happy with that. I'm not saying he would be my choice or who I definitely want. I haven't really thought about that, if I'm honest.
I have.
As much as people would react in horror, I would be perfectly happy with Henry Cavill debuting in 2022 at the age of 39. That would be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. And good luck to him, because I say, nice guy.
What else do we have?
Well, we had. I mean, I don't want to slag it off, but it wasn't that it's bad. The Lost World, no, it's not the Lost World. The Fallen, whatever, Jurassic.
Fallen Kingdom, or whatever it's called.
I just don't get it, because the thing is, it just looks like a remake.
Jurassic Park was one film. That's the problem.
Yeah.
You built something with all the funny thing about Jurassic Park, and it's a film. I'm not going to argue with anyone, because a lot of people listening to this, it will be part of their childhood, so that, even if it's their late childhood. I was just getting to an age where I was getting into indie film and that, so I was probably a bit too cynical in those teen years for Jurassic Park. But it's a 2-hour advert for itself. It's a 2-hour look at these lunchboxes and stuff. And not only that, there's one interesting character in the film, and they sideline him within half an hour. So I've never been the biggest fan of Jurassic Park.
No, I'm not either, to be honest.
But I think that allegory, well, it's a bit like Westworld. In fact, it's the same writer. That idea of a theme park gone wrong and sort of scratched the surface, and it's all very nasty and unethical. I think that's one film that almost required a smaller budget and a darker take than Spielberg.
Yeah. No, I actually prefer The Lost World, which is why I'm kind of pissed off that this new one seems to be...
I don't know. I mean, all I will say is I went to see Jurassic World.
Yeah.
Now, Jurassic World is one of those films that real lovers of Jurassic Park hate.
Is that right? Gosh.
But yeah, they really do. A lot of ranting about it on social media.
Oh, very bizarre.
I have to say, as a non-lover of Jurassic Park, I walked in determined to just see it as its own thing and kind of enjoyed it. Thought it was fine.
Good old Colin Trevorrow.
I don't see how you make half a dozen Jurassic Park films in the same series in like a 12 to 15 year period. I just don't see there's material there.
Well, I mean, there are things that you can do, but I just think this new one doesn't seem to be taking any risks, because as I understood it, I thought they were building up to that, but they're obviously not. It just looks very formulaic and not enough Jeff Goldblum. The whole selling point for me was they were going to bring back Ian Malcolm, and he's got probably what's a one and done.
From the first film, he was this interesting character. He had the most famous speech in the film, and basically they threw a load of adults together who were like, "I don't like kids," and that was the whole of the characterization of them.
Yeah.
They sidelined him with an injury or whatever it was that happened to him in the first half hour of the film. And I think you've just taken the most interesting character, more or less, out of the film.
Yeah.
Put Sam Neill and Laura Dern together, who have zero chemistry.
That's right.
Whatsoever. The action sequences were no good. Some of the set pieces were good. I mean, the shaking cup of water is one of the great shots in cinema history. But none of the action's that good. A dino trying to turn over a car and shit. It's just... it's a film that I've tried again and again and again with, and in fact there was a theatrical release around 2012, something like that, which is bizarre because I don't even think it was 20 years. I think it was 19 years at that point. And I went to see it, and I ended up leaving after an hour because I was bored out of my fucking skull. I didn't storm out in disgust. It isn't one of those, I walked out. It was just, okay, I've not changed my mind. There's other things I can be doing.
Yeah. Like,
What else?
what else? What else? We got Han Solo.
That wears the scars of its production. It doesn't. They don't know what to sell it with, so they've thrown together some shots.
Yes.
They've just thrown together whatever they've shot. I fully expect that film to be competent because it's Ron Howard, but I fully expect it to be wildly underwhelming, and I've seen nothing so far that tells me anything any different. I think that's the type of Star Wars spin-off I don't want. I don't want a Star Wars film that gives me a backstory on every character, no matter. See, I don't mind the Rogue One type of approach where you fill in sort of almost story gaps. But I think fundamentally, I don't want a Boba Fett backstory.
Yeah.
The whole point is the mystery of the guy. It's the same with the Halloween remake. We don't want a full background on Mike Myers. And I don't think we want a full background on Han Solo. Not only that, his whole growth arc takes place through that original trilogy. You know, he shouldn't really be learning anything at all before that.
Yeah, because you kind of take away from the mythology of it, I guess, rather than adding to it.
It's not what I want. I know he's a selling point,
Yeah.
Han Solo, but and I'm not. I don't think recasting is necessarily sacrosanct.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's no need for it. There really isn't. You know, if you want to fill in gaps about hunting down remaining Jedi and have a shitload of Vader in it, fine. But I'll go and see it, and I'll go and see it with an open mind. Genuinely, I'm quite looking forward to it. But that trailer was kind of weak.
Mm. And then they had another rehash of the Avengers Infinity War one, which had already been seen. But that's really been upstaged by the success of Black Panther. Have you seen it?
They come out so quickly now that I think that's not a problem, though. I just think it will be losing steam by the time Infinity War comes out, and they know what they're doing with marketing these things. I don't think it will damage Avengers at all that it came out and did well.
No, I mean, if anything, it will help it. Which is, I mean, that's to be honest, that's the reason I went to it. I wasn't particularly interested in it, but I thought, hey, maybe I'll get an Avengers Easter egg. I was pleasantly surprised. I mean, the action and stuff aren't that as amazing as people think, but the sheer goodwill in the film. It's a beautiful film about family and about, I guess, becoming who you are. And so it's a great origin story. It's a great rite of passage film. It's got so much going for it.
I thought it lost steam terribly, actually. I thought the first half was great, particularly the big Bond riff around that casino.
Yeah, there was Skyfall, wasn't it, basically?
that was the Skyfall casino. It wasn't, but it certainly was lit like it anyway.
Yeah.
It was lighting more than anything else. I suspect if you walked onto an unlit set, they didn't look anything like each other. But, you know, and he had his analogue of Q and all the rest of it. But after basically the Michael B. Jordan character, whose name's Kill something or other, I've forgotten his name now. After he effectively, spoiler alert, takes the crown about halfway through the film, I thought the film was pretty weak after that. But I enjoyed the first half.
Yeah, there was a bit of filler in it, I think. But by its very nature, I think a lot of these movies have it, and I'm sure that the role of Wakanda in Infinity War will probably make more sense for it. I thought his sister steals the show. She has great comic timing, and Letitia. And
but yeah, the Avengers looks. I mean, it was a kind of a sizzle reel in that the average shot length in that trailer was extremely short. It was. In fact, it reflects my biggest worry. My biggest worry is it's just going to be ludicrously overstuffed because you have got to serve a lot of characters in it.
Yes. Speaking of which, let's get on to Robin Hood. So, big cast of characters and lots to serve. Do you want to do it sequentially? You pick the first one?
Okay, let's start with Robin and Marion.
Actually, let's tell people. Have we told people? I forgot to tell people which versions we're going with.
All right. Well, I did watch. I mean, chronologically, I suppose first would be the 1973 Disney film, but I'll quickly just say a few words about that in a minute.
So, which ones were it? We're doing Robin and Marion.
We got Robin and Marion, which is the 1976 Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn film.
Cool.
Quite a good cast in that. I seem to remember Ian Holm and others. Yep. Then we cover the 1991 Robin
Prince
of Thieves, Kevin Costner film. and then we cover the 2010 Ridley Scott
Perfect.
Russell Crowe film.
Right. So fire away.
Yeah.
Robin and Marion first.
Well, just a few quick words on the Disney cartoon, which was actually one of my favourites for years. When I watched it again, the kiddie voices in it were doing my head in. But secondly, Robin Hood is kind of almost reimagined as it's like a shot in the dark. He's robbing people and doing things like that, but he's doing it with all silly disguises and that. It's like Clouseau in A Shot in the Dark.
Yeah.
Not as enjoyable as I thought, and you could see that it's not the golden age of Disney. They're reusing characters or reusing character types, and you've got Phil Harris there as effectively Baloo, but not Baloo. And the animation looks kind of cheap.
Yeah, it was before the Renaissance. We're talking. It was just before sort of your Beauty and the Beast takeoff, wasn't it?
It's post that 1960s peak, 50s
Yeah.
and 60s peak. But yeah, I was just very, very interested in it. It really solidified the thing we'll talk about as we go through, that there's almost not a director I could think of that wouldn't have a take on Robin Hood, whether it would be a cinematic one and anything that people would want to fund.
Yeah.
Is it a matter?
I mean, the definitive. The definitive one, of course, when people think of it or traditionally thought of it, is that Errol Flynn.
It is, although the one in my head is different, and we'll get to it in a minute. But you watch the 1973 Robin Hood, and you think, well, Blake Edwards could have done a Robin Hood film. And then, of course, we get to like Richard Lester with Robin and Marion, which is very much. He is quite light as a director. His Superman films were very light. His Musketeer films were very light. He did A Hard Day's Night, which was quite comedic. It's funny how I think the problem with Robin Hood, from the small sample we've seen, is the only one that really, really plays like a pure Robin Hood film is the Disney cartoon. In that everybody's got a revisionist take on it now. Because a straightforward telling of robs the rich, gives to the poor, lives in Sherwood Forest, wears Lincoln Green has been done so many times that everybody feels they've got to do something new with it, which we'll talk about particularly with the Ridley Scott film. So Robin and Marion is barely a Robin Hood film at all, is it?
I don't even know what the purpose of that film is. 'Cause, I mean, I've seen it. I appreciate it.
It's got no story.
No.
Not really.
And it's not. It's a meditation, I suppose, on death, on aging,
Passage of time.
I think it's
the enduring nature of love, and how love changes over time as well. The gold in that film is the chemistry between Sean Connery and Audrey Hepburn. Now, Audrey Hepburn's one of the most glamorous is the wrong word. Classy women ever to have acted in Hollywood, up there along like a Grace Kelly or something like that. And Sean Connery, the original Bond, still largely thought of as the best Bond, was very much an alpha male and a very sort of raw, primal sexual appeal. So if you'd cast Robin Hood, if you'd cast them both in a Robin Hood film around the time of Goldfinger, for example, it would have played as a chemistry a lot more like Marnie or something like that, like a very almost brutish alpha male take. But you get to 1976, Sean Connery's 46 by this point. She's got to have been about the same age because she was about 64 when she died in the 90s. So they're both mid-40s. They're both past their peak in terms of, pure Hollywood looks and what they were. They're past the iconic images of them both, if you like. When you picture Audrey Hepburn, you picture Breakfast at Tiffany's. Yeah.
And equally with Sean, weirdly enough, when you picture him, you picture two peaks. There's the young man and there's the old man, the bit in between, which is what this falls in.
They worked out how to photograph him in the 80s. They stuck a wig on him and all the rest of him. And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
He comes back as a slightly different screen presence, whereas through the 70s, they sort of let him age but didn't quite know how to photograph him. But anyway, it's the chemistry I've only seen in very long, enduring, happy marriages. Now, long, enduring, and happy are all different concepts, and you very rarely get them in the same marriage. in that you'll see lots of happily married people who've been married south of, say, half dozen years. You'll see lots of longer marriages where maybe they're either not as happy or they haven't. Well, enduring and long aren't the same thing. By enduring, I mean they're both still sort of present in the marriage, i.e., they're not just people who live together who happen to have been together 30 years. There's a real love and affection between them, and it skirts a line that I didn't think Richard Lester could do, because Richard Lester is lacking in any real subtlety as a director. So had you described this film to me and then passed it to me to watch, I would have expected him to be really henpecked in it. I would have expected the look, she wears the trousers kind of approach, and they don't. He just comes back from war to find she's moved on. So there's a point in that about almost deconstructing. We look at sort of a bit like The Dark Knight Returns in that when we think of, say, Batman, we take a snapshot of him when he was about 35 and maybe early to late 30s, but we don't think about these characters moving on. And when he comes back, of course, he's too old to be Robin Hood anymore, and she's too old to be, young maid Marian anymore. But they have a history. They have a history that's 20 years old. She does accept that he's had to go away, and they rekindle like a love for each other, but it's not a hot, burning love of youth. It's a comfortable, deep regard for each other, and I actually love the way they play off each other. I didn't think either of them could do that, because I always thought of her as a little bit too cold and him as a bit too brutish.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in some ways it's a bigger liberty to take to have him age than to have the young story told again, because reality is, I suppose they even call it out in the film, you're lucky to reach 40 in that era.
Yeah, I mean, he does say at one point in the film, I've lived past 40, and that's a good age. I think the problem with it is it's one thing to say, let's deconstruct what Robin Hood is, but you've got to have a vision for what that would be and what you would put in its place. And I don't think the film has that. I think we catch up with him and he's off on the Crusades as a 40-something for King Richard. Can't remember who plays Richard though.
It's Richard Harris.
Of course it is. And then they come, then he comes back and all the rest of it, and there's really not much story here at all, and there's not much camaraderie with anyone. Anyway, the big selling point in this film, the way the two leads play off each other, but it's not. You might, if you're a cineast, you might look back on film history and think, I'd love to see Sean Connery with Grace Kelly, or I'd love to see Audrey Hepburn with Roger Moore, or whatever. You might pair different people together that you never got to see together. Well, you get your wish with this film in that you get two all-time Hollywood A-listers together, but they're not the iconic versions of themselves.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with it, I think. And equally, Robert Shaw versus Sean Connery, the rematch from Rush with Love.
Yeah.
And that doesn't quite work either.
None of it really works. I mean, the thing is, Richard Lester's not a great shooter of action. The action's not very good in it. The story's not really there. And you just watch through this film and it's just a series of unconnected scenes, really. But they aren't like skits. I've seen plenty of films where there are, a series of skits, but it's not funny.
Yeah.
It's not a comedy particularly, although it's got a lightness to it. It's a film we could totally do without.
There should have been skits. Ronnie Barker's in it.
Ronnie Barker's in it as Friar Tuck, very straightly played role as well.
Yeah, he doesn't play it for laughs at all.
Yeah, the film's okay. It's worth a look, but it isn't worth paying for. I mean, I rented it from Amazon, and I'm glad I've seen it now because I waited to see it for a very long time, but there's not much to it, I have to say.
I had to rent it twice because I fell asleep in the first time. I'd say like I had to rent it twice because I fell asleep.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, as I say, everyone's any kind of auteur might have a take on Robin Hood in that you can match themes of Robin Hood to almost anyone's sensibility.
Yeah.
I've already mentioned Blake Edwards because the idea of going and robbing people and using odd disguises and a bit of charm that's not a million miles away from a shot in the dark type humour. You've got Robin Hood almost as, I mean, in most takes he's kind of a disenfranchised nobleman. So you've got that sort of in some takes he's not. He's standing in for like a nobleman, hence the Ridley Scott version. So Robin Hood. You've got Robin Hood as class warfare. You can have Robin Hood as a rollicking action flick, a bunch of sort of outlaws and outsiders. You could have Robin Hood as heist films. No one would want to fund it, but Ken Loach would have a take on Robin Hood.
I don't think. Yeah, I mean, Ken Loach would probably object because it's too commercial. It might be too much like fun.
Of course he would, but he would have a take on what it says about society.
What does it say? I mean, why do we still gravitate to this story? What is it? Is it the 1300s, 1400s? Why is that still timeless and relevant in the 21st century?
Back before that, isn't it? It's like 1190s or something like that. It's in the run-up to the Magna Carta in most versions. The Magna Carta being signed in 1215. I think I'm right in saying.
So it's the 13th century.
13th century, yeah. But yeah, I mean, as I say, in many takes that you see, he's almost trying to right the wrongs of the society he's in, but also the society he's grown up within, because he's grown up ennobled in some versions of it. And it's purely there's always versions where the Sheriff of Nottingham's trying to bleed people with taxes. So again, it's a take that I think would almost appeal to a lot of sort of transatlantic audiences, because the whole idea of like taxes theft.
Yeah.
I mean, there's always some action in it. Archery's always got a certain popularity to it, but you can just have it as guys striking from the shadows. You could. I mean, it wouldn't have all the car elements to it, but you could. There's certainly a take out there that wouldn't be unlike the sort of camaraderie you get in fast films. There are endless possible takes on this. The problem is no one wants to do a traditional take anymore. I mean, really, the version in my head is the 1980s HTV TV show.
Oh, Robin of Sherwood.
Yeah, it was 3 series, 84 to about 86, I think. Michael Praed was Robin Hood in it. And a bit like the Christopher Lambert Tarzan film from the same era, it was the first one where they grimed him up a bit and let his hair grow long.
Yeah, because traditionally Robin Hood had been pretty clean cut, if we're talking sort of...
No, I mean, you've only got to look at, like, Tarzan. Go and look at Johnny Weissmuller. I mean, he looks like he's just stepped out of an Olympic swimming pool, because the actor had. Whereas the Christopher Lambert version, long, lank, matted hair, and all the rest of it. So it had a lovely take to it that way. It had a really good Sheriff of Nottingham, I think that was Nicholas Grace. It had a really good Guy of Gisborne in it. It just had a good cast, and it was no doubt if I went back to it now it'd be awful, but if you could translate what I think that show was onto the screen now or TV, I think I would love it. Every time I see a screenshot of a new Robin Hood, it never quite matches what I'd like it to look like.
No, I think I mean your memories are absolutely accurate. It was a good version, and many other versions owe it a lot.
At the end of this second series, he finds himself basically cornered by a lot of archers and killed. And they're all by a lake at the end of the film, sort of seeing him, mourning him basically, and they're firing arrows into the water. And then a hooded man fires one over the top into the water, and that's the sort of end of that series. And we go into the third series and talking to Sean Connery, Jason Connery, his son, is I think Robert Loxley in that one, but he's a nobleman again who basically takes up the mantle.
Which is probably how the legend developed in the first place, anyway.
Well, I've always heard it was an appropriation of 2 different characters. So I don't.
It was, yeah, it was.
But so he obviously plays the other one, if you like, and that's all I know. Excuse me, anyone who's listening, that I haven't done a huge amount of research on the character. But there was another series of it which I didn't like as much, largely because I loved the Michael Praed version, but it was good, and then it disappeared, and I can only think it was production costs, because it's all on location and it's all period costume and it's all action set pieces and stuff.
Yeah, I mean the BBC then, basically because of Doctor Who's success, they try and bring back stuff that will just be generic kind of Saturday entertainment. There's a version in 2006 that lasts for 2 years. And
which I've never seen.
I tried it. I just couldn't. It just lacked a certain charm or something. I don't know what it was.
Yeah. So then, of course, I grew up really. I'm going to say loving Robin Hood. It's a tiny bit of my childhood in that the 2 years of Michael Praed, which would have only been a year if you think about it, because a series would have come out a year later. The second series would have come out. I remember having the books. There were a couple of spin-off like books and novelizations and stuff. And as like a 10-year-old, I had them. And even the spin-off with the Sean Connery, the Jason Connery character, wasn't as good as well. Even the book wasn't as good. But when I picture Maid Marian, I picture Judy Trott from that show. There was a lot I liked about it, but like I say, it was only about 12 months of my childhood. But for that 12 months, there was enough there that my interest is always piqued when there's a new Robin Hood film. That said, we move on to 1991, and I didn't even see this film theatrically, Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves.
No, why not?
There were two competing versions that year. First time I ever came across the name Uma Thurman. There was a Patrick Bergin version. This often happens in Hollywood, that you get competing scripts and so on, and eventually two end up being made very close together. You think of Olympus as Fallen and White House Down.
Yes.
You think of Volcano and Dante's Peak. You think of, I've just blanked, but there was another one that was right on the tip of my tongue.
Deep Impact and Armageddon.
Deep Impact, that was the one I was thinking of, because I was picturing Morgan Freeman. Deep Impact and Armageddon. So there were competing Robin Hood scripts. The Patrick Bergin version went first. I remember the film show having like a set report on it, and they were interviewing Uma Thurman, who was like at the time of filming about 19, married to Gary Oldman, which a lot of people don't realise now, but Uma Thurman had a very early marriage to Gary Oldman. And she was playing Maid Marian in it, but everything about it looked low budget, which isn't necessarily a problem. But then, of course, there was the glitzy Hollywood version late in the year. The reason I didn't go, I think, would have been Kevin Costner. Now, Kevin Costner, now, I quite like. I mean, when they said he was cast as Jonathan Kent, I thought, that's fucking genius. That's perfect. With the gravitas that age has given him, and this calming, good presence in things, I quite like him. But there was a period of time where he was genuinely one of the biggest film stars, if not the biggest film star in the world. He had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. They kept throwing huge budgets at him, letting him have ever more indulgent running times on his films. And I could not see what it was about this guy, because every time I saw him in a film, he was like a void. It was like not having a leading man in the film. He was like a void. And actually, Robin Hood is right at the apex of that film.
Yeah.
The film itself's not that bad, but he doesn't even attempt an accent. And he's not a leading man. I don't know why Hollywood ever thought he was a leading man. You can do it once with an Elliot Ness character, but Elliot Ness is just walking goodness personified in that film. But anytime you want kind of nuance and shade from him, he couldn't do it at that stage of his career.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a number of factors, Dave. I mean, the thing is, he, by his own admission, was only partly an actor. He becomes a director. And I think that is reflected in the sense that even though he's not necessarily one of our favourite actors, or a lot of people's favourite actors in retrospect from that era, it is undoubtedly a fact that he was a tremendous picker of great movies in which to appear. And you know, he turns up in many of the ones we've actually discussed on here and so on. And so he had a director's eye as an actor. And Robin Hood's a case in point insofar as Kevin Reynolds, who directs it, had, I think, aided Kevin Costner in some of the technical schematics on Dances of Wolves. And there was a sense of returning the favour. Kevin Costner does, I think you can see his sort of technique as a technical actor. On in some of the footage from Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. And to his credit, to be fair to Kevin Costner, he did want to do an English accent, and he did ask to get a dialogue coach and everything like that. I think it was Kevin Reynolds when the end said, "Look, Kevin, just don't bother. Let's just get on with the movie," which was probably the right thing.
I mean, I didn't know any different at the time. I mean, I hadn't seen it for years. I'd only seen it once. I didn't see it theatrically. I saw it a handful of years afterwards. So my best guess would be when it was 3 or 4 years old.
He's the wrong presence for this. I will give you that. And I think Mel Gibson was offered it first, who would have been better.
You need someone a bit more roguish.
Yeah, hence Mel.
Hence Mel.
And Braveheart is arguably a bit of a Robin Hood movie.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it is. But I mean, it starts, of course, with them out on the Crusades in prison, and everything there looks like a set. Everything, even them out on the street, looks like a set. As they get back to England and walk from Dover round the corner to Nottingham, which is kind of funny. The thing that made me laugh is the Azim character. was originally called Nazir, and they changed it because they realised that the Saracen Nazir was a character in the HTV TV show made up for that film,
Gosh.
and they actually thought, oh, possible legal.
Yeah, definitely legal
yeah.
thing.
Because the Saracen Nazir was created. There was a slight sort of spirituality to the TV show, which almost gets forgotten.
Yeah, no, there was. I remember there was one scene about clay or something. Someone making a model of clay and the fingertips on it, which is I think is echoed a little. Because the thing about Prince of Thieves, before you get really into it, is that a little bit like what we said about the Nolan Batmans, where they are nominally realistic, as in you don't have a supernatural or aliens or ghosts or whatever. But remember that line in Batman Begins, is Ra's al Ghul not supernatural? Are his methods not immortal? And then he appears in The Dark Knight Rises, which could be a dream, or if you choose
I think they fudged the question, but they
Yeah.
have to degree about it.
Yeah, and I think in exactly the same way, Prince of Thieves doesn't want to quite go there completely. It doesn't want to be completely Raiders of the Lost Ark, even though it owes a hell of a lot to Indiana Jones, I think. You know.
The problem I've got with the film is a few things. I like Costner more now, but that also means I like him historically more now. In that I can go back and watch stuff from the era and not feel as like, Christ, this guy, as I did at the time.
Yeah.
But it was shot like... Do you know what I thought of when I watched this? I thought of that scene in I'm Alan Partridge, where he was filming for like Hamilton Water Breaks or whatever.
Waterway to have a good time.
Waterway to have a good time, right? And he's at the end of the day's filming, and he's sat in like a beer garden with all the guys, and he's trying to be like bantery, so he's just saying things like, ooh, sex. She was first in the queue when they were handing out chests and stuff like that. And the banter in this film is so forced that it looks like it was written and directed by someone who's vaguely aware that when working class people get together, they have a few laughs, but they have no idea how it works, except they take the piss out of each other a bit.
Yeah.
So I found the banter extraordinarily forced in it. And I've also got a visceral dislike of Christian Slater as an actor, and I think this is possibly why, actually, this film. I think he's really, really dreadful in it. But,
well, we had. I mean, we were at. I was, an 11-year-old, and we'd seen it during the summer. And I went back to school, and the lines that people kept quoting from it was, "When are you going to finish it, brother? Finish what you've started."
Have you got the courage to finish what you started?
Yeah.
It's just, and when you watch it, it's not actually as bad as some pastiche in there, but it's not good.
No.
And not very good at an English accent. They were trying to make Christian Slater a thing, and they never quite managed it. It was post like Heathers and Pump Up the Volume, and you can see it's casting by committee. The best thing in it is, by no surprise to anyone listening, Alan Rickman. Now, when I watched it, I was expecting to find it really, really cartoonish. I was expecting to find him like really, really pantomime, and it's nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. He's actually better than I remember, which, when you think I last saw it probably in my late teens, I would have thought that I would have picked up on like a lack of nuance this time, but I really, really enjoyed him in it.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, casting by committee. I mean, this is a movie made by committee. This is cut and paste the best bits from the 80s and the 90s trends. Rickman, of course, having been the baddie choice du jour after Die Hard, although he wasn't the first choice, interestingly enough. Richard E. Grant was, I think, actually cast. And had to drop out. Yeah, no, not as Hans Gruber, as Sheriff Nottingham.
Oh, all I heard with it was he turned it down twice, this film, Alan Rickman, and when they went back a third time, they made him certain assurances about being able to play the character as he saw fit.
Right.
And he said yes the third time, but that isn't necessarily to contradict that they might have asked other people first.
Right, interesting.
Once again, Kevin Costner's another man that never has any, well, as a younger man, never... I'm about to contradict myself, actually, because No Way Out, he had phenomenal chemistry with Sean Young.
Yeah, but then I think anybody would have had phenomenal chemistry with her in that fur coat.
At that time, yeah. He didn't have a lot of chemistry with his leading ladies, by and large, and it really stands out in this film.
Yes.
Him and Master Antonio might as well be shot separately and plated together.
Yeah, and as I say, they keep trying to copy Indiana Jones, and I know that she's called Marion. But there's a bit where he goes, "Hello, Marion," after she's hit him, and I couldn't help thinking, are you actually trying to echo Raiders of the Lost Ark?
They shoot some scenes. There's a scene where she finds like all his swag.
Yeah.
She makes her way into the forest with her sort of maid, and they're sort of held up by the guy who played Mental Mickey in an episode of Only Fools and Horses. um, yeah, yeah. And they get back to sort of the camp, and he takes her in to show her like all the swag he's stolen, and explain that it's actually he's intercepting these sort of illegally taken taxes. That scene is shot like Raiders. It's lit like Raiders. It's the same color palette as the Nepal bar.
Yeah. There's no excuse for that, really. That lack of innovation, but I can see why. Because I mean, to be fair, I suppose in their way, the indie films.
The middle act of this film.
Yeah.
Is the most Robin Hood we sort of get tonight, really. In that, for the middle act of that film, they are basically holding people up and robbing them.
Yeah.
You do have him sort of getting up to a few capers. You do have him sort of training the guys around him. And you do have, as forced as it might be and not that good, you do get the sort of banter of all the merry men.
Yeah.
So the middle act of this film is actually a pretty traditional Robin Hood film.
Yeah, and to be fair to it as well, one of the things it does get right and does have its own visual scheme on, and does actually have some originality in the shooting of the arrows, the camera following those, which subsequently became a thing. The movie Sniper that came out, I think, a year later did it with bullets, but this one got here first. And the montage of building the forest and of them building an army, things like the filling out of the arrows with the mercury or the metal, and whatnot.
That's why partly why I liked that. I liked because they always magically have all these arms. You see them making them. I quite like that. You don't want to belabor the point, but just to see it is good. But where they're sort of saying to him, that we're not strong enough, we can't fight them. He says, why not fight? You need someone a little less earnest. You need someone a bit more, come on, why not?
Yeah.
Let's have a fucking go.
Yeah.
So he is the wrong casting for the film.
Yes.
He does okay with what he's given. The action ain't bad. The sheriff's fantastic.
Yeah.
I would not have been averse to a sequel here.
Well, there was talk of one, which was going to be... I mean, I don't know how far it got along, but obviously it was a huge hit for Warner's. And
I think it was second that year to Terminator 2.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly.
Kevin has a sort of a sequel problem. He's not a fan of them, although there was talk of Bodyguard 2, and they got quite far along with it, with Princess Diana of all people was going to be.
Fucking hell.
Yeah, no, anyway, but they... No, but Robin Hood and the King of Thieves, I think it was, and he and Azim were going to go back to Azim's country, and it was sort of the journey back to Azim, and I think maybe they would have...
Point again. That's like when they take sitcoms and say, let's go to fucking Miami. And it's like, no, they need to be in their natural environment.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you would have done. Would you have brought in Prince John or King John or whatever? What would you have done? How would you do a sequel to it? Where does it go?
I can't really think, to be honest.
You bring in Jeremy Irons as the sheriff's brother, and he's setting off bombs in Sherwood Forest until Kevin Costner can come and talk to him. And that could...
Robin Hood stood on the edge of the forest with "I hate Nicholas" on the side.
And Azim has to intervene and gets...
And Azim has to intervene.
And Azim has a brother played by Samuel L. Jackson.
Morgan Freeman doesn't come back, so Samuel L. Jackson's there.
I really want to see this. Can we pitch it? Kevin Costner's on Twitter, isn't he? I know someone who went out with Kevin from it, apparently, so maybe they're still in touch. I don't know. I'll send them a line, But
I felt a bit sorry for Kevin Costner, only in as much, and I say a bit sorry, only a bit, because he did extremely well, and he got to indulge himself for quite a few years.
In many ways.
But he went to. I remember he does appear on that. What's that Madonna concert film?
Oh yeah.
He goes back stage anyway, and he's introduced to her in a dressing room. And
yes.
He says, a great show. I thought it was really neat.
Neat. I thought your show was neat, and she puts her fingers down her throat.
And when he left, she was a complete bitch.
Yeah, but then he got his own back, and he sort of said, "Well, she didn't get the part in The Bodyguard, and she kind of wanted that." So
it's just like how lackingly class can you be with a camera rolling? He's just all right. You thought he was a bit twee. It was a bit like Superman the movie when Clark says "swell."
Yeah.
and stuff like that, well, fine. But he's just come in of his own accord and paid you a fucking compliment.
Yeah.
Really don't like that.
Naughty, naughty Madonna. Put you across my
Yeah.
knee. No, we don't
So
do
yeah,
that sort of
I mean, it wasn't the right idea, but you can totally see why Warner's in 1991 wanting a hit, cast him, cast Christian Slater for younger
Yeah.
audiences,
Yeah.
cast Hans Gruber,
Yeah.
cast that girl from The Abyss. You know, I can see
Uh,
why the film came out the way it did.
yeah, look, I mean, it's a perfectly serviceable film. I think, I mean, when
A lot more
people...
this time than the first time because I just accepted it for what it was.
Yeah, when people talk about Alan Rickman, and they remember, I do see why. I prefer to watch Alan Rickman in his quieter performances, his less selfish ones. And I think by his own, you know, what annoyed me at the time is, oh, he steals the show. Well, of course he does, because it's kind of written and rigged that way.
Hired to do that.
And he, by his own admission as well, didn't so much sabotage the script, but you know, he was given free rein to do what he wanted. He brought in Ruby Wax of all people to write lines, which frankly I don't think was necessary. Like they do pull it too far. Like it's year turn 30, year turn 45, and you kind of think there's a point at which the humor takes you completely out of it, and it's either a pantomime or it's not. And I think that's the point at which I was just, even as I was 10 or 11, I was taken out of it. I just thought, come on, you don't have to go that far with the humour. There's a nudge and a wink, and you know.
Maybe it's because I'm familiar with it, James. Because I thought all that the first time I saw it, but when I watched it this week, it didn't feel as quite as unhinged as I thought.
Yeah, maybe.
Going to be, but perhaps that's just because I was expecting it.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I mean, for me, when I think of Alan Rickman, I think of, and it's not a pretentious thing on my part. I just think of stuff that challenged him more as a kind of an actor and director as much as anything else. And that's why I don't necessarily think of him in the big French stuff. Obviously, Hans Gruber is a work of genius. There is no doubting that. And his German accent, contrary to what he thought himself, is I actually think pretty good. So, yeah.
It is. Die Hard is a series that's tried to replicate him ever since and failed.
Yeah. Although Jeremy Irons does do a solid job as the brother, which is why he could have been great as the Sheriff of Nottingham's brother. Speaking of Die Hard, Michael Kamen does the score for Prince of Thieves, and I think it's one of his better ones.
It's fine. There's a bit of that theme that seems to be used in Disney home releases.
It is the same thing. They bought it. They bought the rights.
I thought it was okay. Yeah. I thought it was. I quite like Michael Kamen, and I really like his License to Kill score. But when I did the review of that film, I talked of one of the pieces of music that he did as sounding like the first day of the Argos Christmas sales. And there's always a bit of that in his scores somewhere. There was a couple of bits that really I just thought that's a bit much. But by and large, I liked it. I enjoyed the film just fine. It's quite well shot.
Yeah, I mean there are some. And there are some Bond connections insofar as we talked about, you know, the summer slot. This had one of the reasons I went to see this thing was because I was disappointed there wasn't a Bond movie that summer. But they had a documentary. Have you seen the documentary that I sent you from YouTube? Even a clip of it.
What was this on?
Pierce Brosnan presenting about Robin Hood. And who was Robin Hood?
No,
You have to see it because, on the one hand, if you step outside, we've given Pierce more than we have to Robin Hood this session, but it's very sad in some senses because at the time he was doing this, you can tell it was probably around the time that his dear wife was ill, and so he was.
Harris died in 1991.
Yeah, so it's exactly at that time, and he's obviously
work.
Yeah, and it's obviously the kind of work that he could fit in, but at the same time wasn't going to be too demanding. But he really.
On set for hours,
yeah, he really goes for it. Like he's presenting a documentary, but he does it in soliloquies, and he's got this pair of academic glasses on. I think it's just he's shooting Lawnmower Man, maybe because he's got long hair and glasses on. And he's talking about Robin Hood, but then, and of course it's in the script, and it's not. I'm not saying Pierce wrote this, but there's this bit halfway through, just apropos nothing. He goes, "In fact, Robin Hood is not unlike the man who plays him, Kevin Costner. Kevin Costner who took on the Hollywood system with Dances with Wolves and triumphed against the odds. Something to think about." Yeah? I just thought it's the most bizarre thing I think I've seen in ages, but I loved it. And of all things, Sean Connery turns up at the end of the movie. "I have an objection. I must kiss the bride." And you just think you have to steal the show. Then I hate the phrase "steal the show," as I say. I hate the phrase that they use it about, you know, Alan Rickman's sheriff. But literally in those 2 seconds, there's an entire other film, Richard the Lionheart's Adventures, and where he does go off with Marion. "I'm more charismatic and cool than him." Let's replay The Untouchables.
Yeah. Um,
So we're
I
into
think
Ridley Scott.
yeah, the Ridley Scott version. Yeah. I had a bit of a better time with it this time, but the reason I sigh is there was buzz around this for years. This whole project, I've misremembered some of it. I've misremembered it. That okay, there was a project doing the rounds for years with a lot of buzz under it. If you were halfway paying attention to lots of different film websites, in that you could have missed it quite easily. But I read enough back in those days that I was constantly aware that there was this script called Nottingham doing the rounds. That there was talk of they were trying to find a director for and all the rest of it. Now the bit I misremember is I thought it was always going to be the sheriff playing effectively both characters. But I do believe from everything I've read in the last few days, or I've been reminded that that was actually a later sort of Ridley Scott innovation. But certainly there was the version of the script that was doing the rounds was in the early days of CSI, and it was going to be the Sheriff of Nottingham using the sort of effectively forensics of the time,
Mm.
like Path and Arrow flew and all the rest of it, to sort of try and hunt down Robin Hood. But it was certainly the big selling point was it was from the perspective of the Sheriff of Nottingham.
Mm.
And this was the film that was going to be made. Then Ridley Scott came on board. And this is the bit I've kind of forgotten, but I'm reminded of it now. Ridley Scott was then on board, and suddenly it was going to be where they were both the same person. So he was kind of hunting himself, kind of Oedipus Rex style, I suppose. Although we're not suggesting he got up to him and his mum.
Ooh.
And uh, then all of a sudden, the film is called Robin Hood, not Nottingham. And I think, okay. Then I start hearing rumours that there's a bit of discomfort on set between leading man and director. Then I hear rumours of the budget just being a little bit out of control, which is very unlike Ridley Scott. Ridley Scott is quick and he's frugal. He's quicker than he is frugal, but he can generally bring things on time and budget. And then we get this end result, and the whole thing was ill-starred because Russell Crowe went on the sort of junket for the film and seemed to go out of his way to fucking insult everybody. The most famous interview, and you can look it up, I'm sure an audio exists of it on like a YouTube or whatever. Lawson, the beat radio, the
Mark
radio
Lawson, yeah, front
Mark
row.
Lawson. I really went to say Dominic. That's a different guy. Mark Lawson interviewed him for,
Or is
and
it Dominic? Hang on, I'll check.
no, it is Mark Lawson.
Yeah.
They're different guys. Mark Lawson interviewed him, and Mark Lawson. I mean, I've heard some odd things about him in recent years, but certainly his persona at the time and the way he interviewed people was nothing but polite. And he politely said to him, "What went into your thinking behind the sort of voice you were going to use and how you created the character?" He said, "Because, for example, I can hear bits of Irish in your accent there." And he just went, "You got dead ears, mate," and started insulting him and walked out on the interview. Now, when I first watched the film, and I watched it very close to that interview, I could hear Irish in his accent. I can hear it less on rewatch, actually. It does sound a bit more sort of Nottingham, funnily enough, or at least East Midlands somewhere. Now, so the film arrives on a massive budget with a review saying it's effectively a Robin Hood origin story. Bear in mind, he's the exact same age Sean Connery was in a Over the Hill Robin Hood tale from like 25 years before, 35 years before. They're talking about how it's effectively about all the circumstances around what became the Magna Carta. And the film is just a complete nothing. It sort of is about it is a more political take on Robin Hood in that it's much more about him being drawn in to the sort of struggle for a voice and fair treatment for the downtrodden. But he's not Robin Hood until the last 10 minutes of the film. Well, the last 5 minutes of the film. In fact, maybe even the last shot of the film. And it's at once kind of it's at once pantomime villain territory because you've got Oscar Isaac hamming it up as Prince John, but on the other hand, it's a sort of a serious look at how a group of people went about trying to secure their rights as citizens.
Mm.
and it's neither one thing nor the other. Now, I took my father to see it. My father was quite gravely ill at the time, and I took him to see a few films that summer when he wasn't working and all the rest of it. And one of them was this. Another one was Toy Story. Toy Story 3 was a really hard watch with him because it's all about the passage of time, and I've got my dying father sat next to me. But anyway, I went to see Robin Hood with him, and there's a bit where they're fighting on the beach, and he like leaps up in slow motion and roars, and we laughed our asses off. It was just unintentionally funny in places. It was also an era where Mark Strong was the villain in everything, and it was getting tiresome. So I thought this was just hugely underwhelming. There were a couple of good things about it. I like Kate Winslet in it. They cast age appropriate
Blanchett.
for a part. Sorry?
Blanchett.
What did I say?
Winslet.
Did I? Shit, sorry.
Doesn't matter.
Kate Blanchett plays Maid Marian in it. They cast kind of age appropriate in that she will have been maybe about 43 at the time, and he was about 45, 46.
Mm-hmm.
They put no makeup on her, or any makeup they put on her is only sort of just for lighting. She looks unmade up. She's feisty without being one of these kind of she wears the trousers types, which is just done to death as a trope. The whole thing of him sort of almost coming back to sort of impersonate a dead man just to fulfill a dying promise, I kind of liked. But it's a very bitty film, and I've been very bitty in describing it. What did you think?
I'm one of its defenders, insofar as I enjoy it as a film. I do not regard it as a Robin Hood film. I see it as a lot of things. I do see it as a missed opportunity because I wanted to see Nottingham. I was particularly interested in the idea of Sienna Miller being in it, but then I'm very interested in Sienna Miller being in anything.
Sienna Miller in everything. I know you
That's right. Terrible thing. Anyway, she is lovely. There you go.
You cast her in the shark as the shark if they need great job.
She'd be very good, I'm sure. Anyway, where was it? Oh yes, and there was some buzz about that. I think it would have been a revisionist, interesting take, which would have been a good historical teaching tool, whilst also being an interesting movie. I felt it was, despite all that, kind of the sequel to Gladiator that we never got, and I think that's why it was made to some extent in the way that it was. Russell Crowe, they didn't sequelize Gladiator. It wasn't a franchise, even though I think Nick Cave wrote a very surreal treatment for it, which was never going to go ahead, because we were talking earlier on about the supernatural. The film was either supernatural or it hints at it or it isn't. That went full on. And I don't think that was ever going to get made. And Master and Commander, of course, which should have been the obvious launching point to kind of capitalise on that.
Master and Command is the sequel I want.
Yeah, me too. And yet for whatever reason it didn't take off. So this is a very pared down, very simplified thing. I think that I mentioned Braveheart and Robin Hood, and the other thing about Russell Crowe is, although he is, to my mind anyway, one of the finest actors ever, he's up there in the pantheon with Laurence Olivier and Brando and Pacino and various others. As a movie star, I think his appeal was basically Gladiator, which at the time, and I remember thinking this as a sort of a, because as you know, it takes me a long time. I get quite entrenched in a way of thinking, and I'm then behind, and then I catch up or whatever it was. But I remember thinking, this is just the guy you can't get when you can't get Mel. This is the guy you get when you can't get Mel Gibson, which is how I felt at the time. I mean, that wasn't. And if I watched The Patriot and Gladiator that same summer, that were obviously different but similar in certain beats, and Braveheart and so on. This is like him trying to have a franchise, because Mel at least had Lethal Weapon, Hugh Jackman had Wolverine, Tom Cruise's Mission Impossible, whatever. But this was like Gladiator 2 without being Gladiator 2, and it was like a Robin Hood film without being Robin Hood. I felt the battle stuff was great. The invasion scenes were wonderful.
It's got scale, which they don't often have for budgetary reasons normally.
I love the music. The music by Mark, is it Strettenfield, who's a Hans Zimmer protege?
Very, very Hans Zimmer the score, yeah.
Yeah.
I had to look it up to check it wasn't Hans Zimmer.
Yeah, me too. But it is quite rousing.
It's all got a little bit tired now, but I mean back then it was a degree fresher. You know, I don't think Russell Crowe's that bad in it. I think first time I thought his accent was all over the place. It seems much more consistent on rewatch. He has some chemistry with Kate Blanchett. He might have some with Kate Winslet as well. I don't know.
I think Russell Crowe has chemistry with everybody.
Yeah, I think so. I think he's one of those actors.
He's
that,
likable. He's likable.
They
You know.
can normally do English accents as well, Antipodean. So like he could have been a Bond probably as well.
He was offered it. He was offered it.
Certainly as a Master and Commander, I would love to see a sequel to. That to me should have been the Best Picture winner that year, not Return of the King. But the film doesn't seem to know what it wants to be. At times, I mean, there's a point where he talks openly to the king with people around him, or Prince John, with all the people around him about, people's rights and all the rest of it. And I'm thinking, there's a really serious film and a really serious point in all of this.
Yeah.
But only a few scenes earlier, we were all fucking swashbuckling.
And that is very Braveheart, that stuff.
What does this film want to be?
Yeah.
It lacks any real levity. There's a little bit between him and Blanchett. They've tried very hard to get a bit of sexual chemistry or tension in there, particularly when she undresses him when he needs a bath.
Yeah, it's not too bad. I mean, it is there.
I just thought it was a disappointment, but I had a better time with it this time than last time.
Yeah. I mean, as I say, it is a missed opportunity. I don't know what the point of it was, because it didn't work as a blockbuster. It didn't do particularly good business, as I understand it. Am I right about that?
He'll just look it up. I mean, just while I'm looking that up, Master and Commander didn't get a sequel because it was a $130 million film 15 years ago, and it just did not do enough. It just didn't do enough, unfortunately.
Well, it's a very difficult film to watch. It's brilliant, but whereas Robin Hood is actually entertaining, but it didn't do, popcorn business.
Okay. The budget for Ridley. Now this is a Robin Hood film, right? 200 million was the budget. I think that's high for a Robin Hood film, personally.
Yeah.
Box office 321.7, so it didn't even get to double its budget. That's one of those where, if everyone desperately wanted to do a sequel, they could go the Jack Reacher route of cut all your budgets and do it smaller scale, and everyone takes a pay cut.
Yeah.
If you wanted to do a sequel. But that's not quite enough business. That really isn't enough business to immediately say it needs a sequel.
It's also 10 years on now, nearly. Well, it's 2010, wasn't it? So
2000. I mean, you're not going to get one now. But I'm just looking at Master and Commander while I'm at it. Master and Commander was at a budget of 150 million, not 130. Did 212. Just not enough.
Well, weirdly enough, they are talking about a sequel to that now. Now they are.
Tweeted something.
Yeah.
Which everyone immediately latched on and retweeted the shit out of, myself included. Master and Commander, anyone listening, if you've not seen it, terrific film. It's the best Star Trek film we've had in 25, 30 years.
It's the best Star Wars film as well.
Well, no, but you look at Star Trek, and it's very much it certainly the original conception of it. There was a lot of Horatio Hornblower in it.
Yeah, totally.
Conception of both Kirk and Picard, and that sort of the captain on his ship. With his dedicated crew sort of exploring, there are parallels. They are obvious if you think of them. And Master and Commander, it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful film.
Yes. And, who knows? It might well help. I mean, it's funny you mentioned Star Wars there. You mentioned Oscar Isaac earlier on. It's one of the points we, as gentlemen, we can agree to disagree on. I think one of the reasons I get so pissed off at Oscar Isaac playing this blank character, to me he's blank anyway, of Poe Dameron in Star Wars, is that I watch him in Robin Hood there, and he's such a great baddie. He's like a junior Blackadder. He is to this Robin Hood what Alan Rickman was to some extent, obviously not at quite the same scale to Prince of Thieves. To the extent that I sometimes wonder if you were to flip it over, if you were to look at The Last Jedi, there are moments where I just think, do you know what? It'd just be interesting, just in an alternate universe, to see, what if you put Adam Driver as Poe Dameron, and you had Oscar Isaac as Kylo Ren? Because Oscar Isaac's very good at capturing things like petulance and uncertainty and so on. And Adam Driver would convince us an action hero in the sense that he was a real-life Marine. It was just a thought. And he has a look of sort of, He's Charles Bronson crossed with Keanu Reeves. So there are moments in The Last Jedi, so if you just flipped it over, it's not that I don't like Oscar Isaac as an actor, because I do. It's just that I sometimes think, God, there's so much more you can do than be this sort of cut-price Han Solo. When in fact they now have another cut-price Han Solo. But there you have it. I've moved on. But no, I do like it as a film, Robin Hood. I appreciate I'm in the minority of it. I appreciate that it was meant probably to launch a franchise.
This time. And bear in mind, I just watched Robin and Marian, which,
Yeah.
as discussed, was a bit of a nothing film.
Yeah.
Then I watched Prince of Thieves, which is very, very safe.
Yeah, it's a pop video, Robin Hood.
So I get to this one, and whilst there's a lot wrong with it, it's got ideas.
Yeah.
They aren't particularly cohesive. They don't. It doesn't stick to one idea.
Yeah.
But the whole. See, if you went into a studio and say, pitched a Robin Hood film and said, what we want to do is make it about the conception of the Magna Carta, they'd laugh you out the fucking room. So I appreciate you've got to dress it up in something else, but I don't really know what they've dressed this up in.
Yeah, it doesn't know what it wants to be. But the long and the short of it is, even a terrible film in the canon of Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe is still Ridley Scott and Russell Crowe, and that's one of the greatest actors and greatest directors.
He is genetically incapable of making anything less than a beautiful film, isn't he?
That's right. That's right.
His films always look wonderful. I mean, the real one for me with that was Prometheus. I mean, Prometheus was shot in a fucking quarry.
It's still beautiful.
And it's still beautiful. I mean, you're looking at sort of black, sort of sand and clay through that film, and it's still gorgeous. He's possibly the best cinematographer that's ever lived. He's just been wearing the moniker of director.
That's right. That's right. And he's a good leader.
We have another version of Robin Hood coming this year.
Taron Egerton, yes, who is a very promising leading man. I think he's a little bit young to play Robin Hood, but you know.
It depends how old Robin Hood is. I mean, if they really are wanting to do a franchise, then maybe. The bit that's really, really got two things looking at the casting for it. Well, several, actually. Jamie Foxx as Little John. Okay. But looking at the casting, there are two things that just make me go... One makes me go, what? And the other one makes me go, oh, yes, I can't wait for that. The one that makes me go, what? Is Tim Minchin as Friar Tuck. Tim Minchin as Friar Tuck.
Well,
I can't see that. That is the most random casting in the world.
He's bald.
That's like, well, he's not, is he?
Well, he's got a bit of a bald spot, bit of a beard.
Okay, fair enough. It's like casting me as fucking like Ava Gardner.
That's a bit of a stretch.
But anyway,
when you say casting you as Ava Gardner or casting you as
in Ava
Gardner. You're too big. She liked them small, Dave. She liked people like Frank Sinatra and Mickey Rooney.
Okay, well.
Seriously, she had a thing for quite tiny men.
Yeah, it was just a name I threw out. Won't worry about it. I'm not.
There's some subconscious reason for it deep down. Maybe it's the King Arthur connection, because Ava Gardner was once in a King Arthur film, and that's what takes us into the next.
And we will come on to those next time. I do want to say though, the Sheriff of Nottingham in this particular Robin Hood adaptation.
Oh, in the Ridley Scott one.
No, the new one.
The new one
coming. Ben Mendelsohn.
Right. Amazing.
I am very, very happy with that.
Although, you mentioned Mark Strong earlier on, who ends up being sort of the baddie du jour.
Yeah, no, there is a bit of that, I suppose.
Yeah, and it's very much, he's playing an administrative baddie, which is what he was in Rogue One and Dark Knight Rises. But the great thing about that is that we mentioned Dark Knight Rises, which gives me an excuse to mention...
You have to cherry pick slightly with him to get to that point, because since Rogue One, he played George VI in Darkest Hour.
Yeah.
Completely convincingly. I mean that. He was completely convincing.
He was very good. He was very good.
You know, no, he's actually, if anything, he's marked by quite a lot of. He's very, very versatile. I mean, I don't know if I recommend the series or not. In that I got 4 episodes or so into the second season and I gave up because it was so slow. But there is a Netflix original out there called Bloodline.
Yes.
Which is set in the Florida Keys. It's got Kyle Chandler in it, Sissy Spacek, the late Sam Shepard. He was obviously one of the last things he ever did. And he plays like the black sheep of the family, Danny. And it's a bad guy role, but it's a completely wastrel bad guy role. It's a completely different flavour of bad guy role. I would watch anything Ben Mendelsohn did. That's the thing driving me to the cinema for the next one. I did see a screenshot of this film, and it concerned me because it had that feel of like almost the BBC version of it, in that there he is with nice short hair, clean cut again, and I'm not sure. But let's see how it turns out.
Yeah, Drew's out. I want Taron to do well because he's actually one of the few younger actors where I don't sit back and jealously pretend that I could do better, knowing maybe that I probably could have done. But with him, he's got such a good will about him. He's a genuinely talented character actor, as you saw with Eddie the Eagle Edwards. He's convincing in action, as saw in Kingsman, and there's a decency about him. I think there's a reason he went very well with Hugh Jackman. We mentioned earlier on. There's a real sense of decency about that kid. At least for the moment, we shall see.
Eddie the Eagle's decent film.
Unlike there was about the original Robin, because I mentioned Errol Flynn in my research for this podcast. The stuff there's an entire podcast on that. Just with stuff I read about Errol Flynn, God rest his Robin Hood.
I'm happy to do something on Errol Flynn down the line. But
yes,
Robin Hood, endlessly enduring character, because you can see what you want in it. If you want like a swashbuckling anti-hero, he can be that. If you want someone standing up for the downtrodden, he can be that.
Yeah.
If you want someone, if you come from a sort of higher strata of society and you want to see someone sort of almost shaking off the shackles of sort of duty and what's expected of a man of his time, you can see that in it. There's always a romance element to it. There's always a good sort of kinship and friendship element to it. And by nature of where you're shooting these things, the end result normally looks pretty decent as well.
Yeah. And there's, like I say, the timeless theme of class, which is in the news at the moment. The BBC and stuff like that. The idea of, can you be both middle and a little bit upper? Can you be upwardly mobile and so on? And Robin is a guy who manages to bring classes together in a common cause. What comes after you bring down the bad Prince John or the evil sheriff or whatever, when Richard comes back, is another story in itself. And that's a new take that's waiting to be done. What comes next? And I don't mean a Robin and Marion sort of the death of Robin Hood. I mean when you've brought down
Marion, you've got them coming back years later.
Yeah.
It's almost painting those years. Is there ever a time where Robin does slay the big bad wolf? What comes next?
Yeah, exactly. As in, is he the next wolf? Which is where the Nottingham script maybe could be rediscovered and tweaked and remade properly.
So we're looking to next time, James. We're looking to do something around Arthur. Now I've watched the I've watched the 2004 version. I watched it with fucking matchsticks, holding my eyes open.
Just because Clive Owen's voice.
It is partly Clive Owen's voice, but he's not a leading man, which is the theme I talk about a lot of people with, and I really will return to with him. It's very dull and sort of worthy. And that I did follow it with the fucking Motley Twat version from last year.
You are taking fucking liberties, King Arthur.
The Guy Ritchie version where he's just cast. I don't know what he's done there. Yeah, it's not off to a promising start, but maybe you can suggest another couple that we can bulk it out with.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, there's the great thing about King Arthur, in a way, almost that goes way beyond Robin Hood, is that the lore of it extends to so many versions that maybe go through the hero's journey in a similar way, but don't have to be a King Arthur movie. So if we're all Arthured out, which we may very well be, and you want to visit a movie that has some Arthurian lore. I mean, I mentioned The Last Crusade, I mentioned Fisher King, Holy Grail, of course, Monty Python. There are so many takes on it, and there's.
We'll talk about that offline, but that's certainly like the next thing we'll
So, listeners, that's what your next treat will be, and we will endeavour to get that out in the next couple of weeks after this one. So, Dave, just remind them where else they can find you in the meantime.
You can find me, as I'm about to start in the next 5 minutes, recording Do You Expect Us to Talk? At Expect Us to Talk on Twitter, facebook.com/Expect Us to Talk. Started Life as a Bond podcast. Is now just a pretty generic film retrospective series podcast. So at the moment we're on Tarantino. Before that we did Back to the Future, Star Wars. We're going to go on to Marvel next. Find all of that at either of those places or Cinematronics with an X.co.uk.
Fabulous. Well, thank you for listening. Stay warm wherever you are, or stay cooler if you're in a very warm climate. And see you in the next couple of weeks. Take care. God bless. Bye now.
Good night, folks.